It all started with a single joke. Just one, tossed across the Christmas table like a careless stone. My brother smirked. "So, you finally sold your little stock portfolio?" The others laughed, sharp, metallic laughter echoing off the crystal glasses. Dad raised his wine, pride gleaming in his eyes, the same way it always had, cold and heavy as gold. I smiled back, quietly. I had learned long ago that silence was the sharpest weapon. They didn't know what I'd done. They didn't know the nights I'd spent in that dim office, screens flickering, tracing numbers that hid their lies. They didn't know the meetings, the signatures, the quiet moves, all beneath their noses. The company they'd built, the one that crushed people under polished shoes and fake smiles, it was finally mine again. Not by chance. Not by luck. By design. As laughter filled the room, I looked around the table, the fine silver, the glittering tree lights reflecting in their eyes. To them, it was another perfect family dinner. To me, it was Judgment Day. The wine tasted bitter on my tongue, like truth trying to crawl out. Then my phone buzzed. A name flashed across the screen, one that turned the air to glass. The Treasury Department. The sound of forks clinking against plates stopped. My brother's laughter froze halfway through a smirk. Dad's glass hung suspended midair, the red wine trembling at the rim. And in that silence, I felt something shift. For years, I'd been the quiet one. The naive one. The one they mocked. But tonight, they finally saw the truth. This wasn't about money anymore. It wasn't even about revenge. It was about justice, long overdue, and beautifully timed. And as the snow fell quietly outside the window, I realized something I'd waited my whole life to feel. Power doesn't shout. It whispers right before the storm begins. The table. Laughter filled the room, sharp, echoing, almost too loud. The long mahogany table gleamed beneath the chandelier, its surface crowded with roast platters, silver cutlery, and half-empty wine glasses. Every voice tried to outshine the other, as families often do when pretending happiness. I sat near the end, where the lights didn't reach as brightly, where silence felt safe. My brother's voice cut through the noise, competent, commanding, as if he owned the air itself. He always did. But beneath the hum of chatter and the faint melody of Christmas music, I could hear it, that quiet, invisible hum of tension. The one that only old wounds know how to make. Still, I smiled. Because tonight, the game was mine. Mother passed the gravy bowl with that polite, porcelain smile, the one she wore whenever peace had to be staged. "You've always been the quiet one," she said softly. Too softly. I nodded, watching the steam curl from my plate like smoke from a long-buried fire. Across from me, Father poured more wine. His hand steady, but his eyes restless. The scent of cedar, roast, and expensive wine filled the air. But under it all was something bitter, the smell of unspoken truths. The conversation drifted toward money, as it always did. And I could feel their attention turn, like a camera lens sharpening on its target. And then, it came, the spark that lit the fuse. My brother leaned back, grinning like a man who thought he'd already won. "So," he said, "you finally sold that little stock portfolio?" Laughter followed, practiced, patronizing. Dad chuckled, shaking his head. "Now you're really broke, sweetheart." The word sliced through the air, light on the tongue, heavy on the heart. I smiled, meeting their eyes, letting the silence stretch just long enough. "That's right," I said. "But sometimes, when you lose, you win." Their laughter returned, thinner this time, uncertain. And in that fragile sound, I could already hear a breaking. Because deep down, I knew this was the last night they would ever laugh at me. The sound of their laughter was louder than it should have been. It rattled against my ears, every chuckle scraping across my nerves like a blade. "Don't be so serious," my brother said, shaking his head. "It's just a bit of fun." But it wasn't fun. Not when the same joke had been thrown at me for years, every Christmas, every birthday, every time I tried to be part of the family. I smiled because I had to. because that's what you do when you're the quiet one in a family full of egos. But tonight, that smile hid more than they could imagine. My father raised his glass toward me, sloshing the wine as he spoke. "You should have stayed in business with us," he said. "You had potential. Instead, you ran off to play with numbers that didn't matter." The words hit like a slap, the same words that had always defined my place in this family. I didn't answer. I just looked at him, really looked, until he shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "You always said you wanted to be free," he muttered, almost to himself. "But freedom doesn't pay bills." I smiled again, but this time it was sharper. "Neither does greed," I said. The table fell silent for a moment. The kind of silence that feels heavy, like everyone's holding their breath, waiting for someone else to break it. My mother cleared her throat, pretending not to notice the tension, and began to serve the pudding. But the air had already changed. I could feel it. The balance was starting to tip. And as I glanced down at my phone, a single message flashed on the screen: "It's done." My heart thumped once, twice. I slipped the phone back into my pocket. The game had officially begun. As the conversation drifted on around me, small talk, forced laughter, the clink of cutlery, I heard it all as if from the other side of a pane of glass. Words passed through the air and landed somewhere behind my ribs, muffled by things I had learned to keep to myself. My mind, stubborn and unwilling to stay anchored to polite dinner chatter, slipped back to the moment when my world had first tilted, the meeting in my father's office, the warm leather of his chair, the smell of pipe tobacco and old paper, and the heft of a fountain pen that signed my erasure. I remember the way the light fell across his desk the afternoon he handed me what looked like a graceful solution, a paper promising settlement, transition, for the best. He explained it as if he were offering comfort. "You're too emotional to run things," he said with that practiced softness, the kind used to disguise the blade beneath. That single adjective, emotional, landed like a brand and never washed away. For them it was justification, for me it felt like a verdict. The word replayed in my head over the years, a small burning coal that never went out, warming something ferocious inside me. Only recently, I'd learned to change the nature of that burn. Where once emotion had made me falter, now it honed me. I discovered that feeling fiercely could be mapped, measured, and turned into a tool. Emotions, grief, humiliation, indignation, became data points, fueling patience and strategy rather than paralysis. The memory of that day in my father's office no longer left me empty. It filled me with a plan, a slow, deliberate architecture built on the very thing they used to dismiss me with. Tonight, seated beneath chandeliers and feigned cheer, I let that memory sit on my face as a smile, because a smile can keep a knife from showing until you're ready to use it. The weeks that led here were patient as a spider's weaving. I had walked quiet corridors, made 1,000 small, polite inquiries that gathered like snow on a roof, a slight accumulation that, once heavy enough, might collapse what lay below. There were late nights with lamps burning low, poring over ledgers, cross-referencing names and dates, building a lattice out of receipts, invoices, and whispered confessions from men who once trembled when my father's name filled a room. People who had once bowed now slid me documents like contraband. Fear had a way of loosening tongues, and greed had an index that could be followed to every hidden account. I learned to speak in margins and footnotes. I sat in cafes and listened until I could transcribe motive into math. I met couriers, lawyers with tired eyes, and civil servants who kept their professional indignation gentle, the kind of people who quietly collect proof and wait for a legal hand to fall. I became the ghost that haunted the corridors of the business, the rumor at the edges of boardrooms, the one they never thought to examine because ghosts aren't supposed to take names and file subpoenas. I moved in the spaces they left unguarded, a misplaced stamp, an unsigned authorization, a duplicate invoice for a non-existent subcontractor. Small things. Deadly things. "You've been quiet all night," my brother said then, his voice cutting like someone flipping on a harsh light in a dark room. He pulled me back to the table with that easy mockery he had always used to keep my silence. "Thinking about money again?" he asked, smirking as if finance were a toy he alone knew how to wield. I met his eye and let the faintest smile lift the corner of my mouth, not the smile of apology or submission, but the small, composed smile of someone who knows how the chessboard will fall. "No," I said, measuring the words. "I'm thinking about consequences." The sentence was small, but it carried the weight of every ledger I had ever read. He frowned, uncertain, the muscle in his jaw working as he tried to translate my calm into something he could dominate. The moment his confusion lengthened, my phone buzzed, a sound so ordinary it could have belonged to any evening. I stared at the screen, unknown caller. My thumb hovered because timing is always the blade's edge. Too soon and the impact scatters, too late and the chance is lost to the flow of human distraction. I had spent months arranging the elements so that a single notification could slice through a century of complacency. Tonight, timing mattered more than fury. So I waited, feeling the laughter around me metamorphose into a countdown. Forks clicked like the ticks of a metronome, the music was a soft drumbeat, the grandfather clock in the hall thudded on its steady spine. Each ordinary sound wrapped itself around the plan like twine, and with every turn, the knot tightened. The room, with its warm light, its well-placed jokes, its practiced love, looked more and more like a stage. I sat like an actress who had rehearsed silence until it became performance. In their world, I had been unremarkable, the quiet shadow in the family portrait. Tonight, I was becoming the author of the photograph's caption. The laughter continued, unaware it was the prelude. The smile I wore felt strange and candid at once, a smile that held history, a smile that contained long files and whispered testimonies, a smile that had spent the last months turning pain into evidence. For them, I was still the quiet one who could be edged out and patronized. For me, in that electric hush, I was the reason the picture-perfect evening would fracture. Because when a joke has been told enough times, it stops being amusing, and becomes the thing that pushes a wound open. Tonight, I would press against that wound until the family's polished veneer would crack and a rod underneath would show for what it had always been. The company was my father's cathedral, the place he pointed to when he wanted to prove he mattered. He would tell the story 100 different ways, how he started with nothing and how, with grit and genius, he built an empire. It made a good speech at charity dinners and a fine line in family stories. But stories are made of omission as much as fact. In the half-light of my memory, the truth always looked different, corridors filled with people who never got their due, office chairs warmed by hands that received only orders, names on payrolls that never matched the faces who did the work. The story my father told was a comfort for him and a shield for the rest of the family. It left out the ledger lines where real human cost was recorded. My brother wore my father's pride like a well-cut suit. He inherited the grin that was never meant to be friendly. It was a display, a warning. When he walked into a room, people shifted. That is power passed down, not taught. When I left, they crowed that I'd fail. They predicted I'd come back humbled and asking for a place at the feet of the very men who had dismissed me. It was a story they needed to believe because it maintained a narrative that benefited them. I did not return. Instead, I set my days to a different work, quiet, slow, meticulous. I mapped their missteps the way a botanist maps a hidden root system, carefully, patiently, until I could see the disease for what it was. Every error, every forged signature, every shortcut they took to fatten profits became a mark on a growing dossier. I collected them not like trophies but like seeds of inevitability. Plant enough seeds, and you will grow a forest that cannot be burned away by excuses. Their house had a smell that tasted of success to those who had never dug beneath it. It was the perfume of polished heritage, lemon oil on the banister, the bittersweet top note of expensive wine, leather that had been warmed by 1,000 congratulatory hands. But scents lie. Beneath those curated aromas, there was rot, the faint sourness of secrets left to stew, the metallic tang of bloodless deals. If you listened closely, the house breathed like a living thing that had been trained to hide pain. I thought of the men and women who had walked into factories at dawn, who had taken home paychecks with holes in them because someone in an office had decided a rounding error could disappear into the margins. I thought about contractors paid late or not at all, about families who had been promised pensions that never arrived. I thought about the phantom companies and the invoices that paid nothing but lived on paper, the shell entities that fed a larger lie. I tried to stop them once. I raised questions that were dismissed with polite condescension and private threats. I had been silenced with smiles and legalese, with the rhetorical hand that tells you you're being emotional when you are being right. So I learned a new language, the language of patience and evidence. I listened to accounting slips, to hushed conversations at the end of bar nights, to the rhythm of numbers that don't lie. There is a pedagogy to quiet. When you are still long enough, people reveal the edges of their deceit without meaning to. And when you learn to hear those edges, you can undermine a whole edifice from the inside out without ever raising your voice. Candlelight plays tricks. It flatters, softens, makes history seem neighborly. That night the flame wavered as if the air itself remembered something, and in the way it hit my father's face for a breath, for a second, I saw a stranger. Not the man who had taught me to tie my tie or read bedtimes aloud, but a creature prophet whose tenderness had calcified into calculation. The lines by his mouth were not merely age, they were the marks of someone who had practiced dismissing moral questions. For a moment, all the portraits on the walls seemed to look away as if ashamed to be hung where such a man presided. A tightening happened inside me that was not grief. It was a readiness, the sense that a machine's slow gearing had finally reached the gear that would click everything forward. Anticipation felt like an animal sitting very still before it strikes, not cruel, not eager, only focused. Somewhere, unseen, the first domino had actually slid, a small thing, an email sent, an account flagged, a transfer delayed, and the chain reaction had begun. They did not yet know. In their voices and their jokes and the way they poured wine with rehearsed confidence, they were still actors in a play they believed they controlled. But the set had been weakened at its joints. I sat back and watched him, not with the tenderness I had once felt, but with careful attention. For years I had been given the role of the sentimental child in the family drama. Tonight, that role had been exchanged for one of intention. The candlelight kept dancing, oblivious. Outside, the winter wind rubbed at the windows like a scolding hand. Inside, the gilded world was quietly losing its hold. The anticipation that tightened my chest was less about triumph and more about the completion of a long labor. It felt like the moment before a storm breaks, electric, inevitable, and strangely clean. Weeks before tonight, I met with a man who knew too much, a name that could ruin them. He wasn't from the company. He was from somewhere higher. "If I bring you proof," I said, "will you listen?" He had. And that proof, those files, had changed everything. I had given him the story of their crimes, every dollar, every deception. The deal was simple. Once he had the evidence, he'd act. And when he did, it would be tonight. But there was always risk. If they discovered what I'd done, they'd destroy me. I'd lose the only thing I had left, my peace. Yet as I looked across the table, that fear was fading. I'd spent too long being afraid. The sound of my brother's laughter reminded me of that. So did the way my father's words always silenced me. I wasn't here to play small anymore. I was here to finish the job. The clock ticked past 8. The rain outside began to fall harder, tapping against the windows like fingers on glass. "Storm's coming," my mother said, looking out. She didn't know how right she was. I glanced down at my phone again. No message this time, just the last one. "It's done," I whispered to myself, then let it rain. The house grew louder as the night aged, not just in sound, but in weight. Every laugh, every clink of glass seemed to echo a little too sharply, bouncing off the marble floors like restless ghosts. Maybe it was the wine that loosened their tongues, or maybe it was the pressure they'd spent years pretending didn't exist. Whatever it was, I could feel it, the thin fabric of their performance beginning to tear. The air was thick with the scent of roast and perfume, but beneath it all was something sour, tension, regret, fear, the kind people don't notice until it's too late. My father's booming laugh rang out from the head of the table, followed by my brother's predictable echo. The sound used to intimidate me, but now it felt hollow. Like a drum with nothing inside. I traced the rim of my wine glass, the cool edge grounding me in the storm of noise. Around me, the world was pretending to be whole, pretending to be good. My mother smiled mechanically at another one of my brother's jokes, her fingers trembling slightly as she reached for her drink. Even she felt it, though she'd never say it aloud. Everyone was too busy performing happiness, keeping the illusion intact for one more Christmas, one more photo, one more toast. Except me. I wasn't performing anymore. I was waiting for silence, for the exact second when all the laughter would stop and the truth would finally speak for itself. The chandelier hung above us like a crown of glass, glittering, immaculate, cold. Its light touched everything in gold, masking the cracks beneath the surface. Every reflection in the polished plates and crystal goblets felt like an echo from a stage play, too perfect, too composed. The longer I watched, the more artificial it all seemed. My brother was at the center of attention, of course. His voice carried across the table, proud and careless, weaving tales of his latest deal, all victories, no conscience. He had my father's gift for charm, and his curse of believing it could excuse anything. My father nodded approvingly, talking about an upcoming expansion, about profits and dominance as if those words still had meaning. But I knew better. Every dollar they bragged about, every triumph they toasted, it was already spoken for. Counted. Traced. Their empire, so carefully built on deception, had already been pierced by the truth. They just didn't know it yet. My eyes flicked toward the clock on the far wall. 8:27. The second hand seemed to move slower than usual, dragging time through molasses. My chest felt tight, every heartbeat too loud in my ears. The air vibrated with something unseen, not quite danger, not quite relief, but something between the two. Something inevitable. I reached for my glass again but didn't drink. My fingers were steady, but my pulse wasn't. Somewhere deep down, I knew the moment was already in motion. I just had to wait for it to find me. Then it happened, small, sharp, deliberate. Buzz. Buzz. The sound sliced through the laughter like a blade through silk. My phone, face down beside my plate, trembled once more. The world around me kept spinning, the clatter of forks, the laughter, the idle talk of people too self-assured to notice how fragile their comfort really was. But my attention tunneled to that one vibration. I turned the phone slightly, just enough to see the screen light up beneath the dim gold of the chandelier. One message. One word. Now. That was all it took. My heartbeat stuttered, once, twice, then steadied into a rhythm I hadn't felt in years. The kind that comes not from panic, but from purpose. I looked up slowly, my eyes scanning the table, memorizing every detail. My father's proud, unknowing face. My brother's smirk, mid-laugh. My mother's nervous hands folding a napkin again and again. The world hadn't changed, not yet. But I had. And somewhere, far away, servers were freezing, accounts were flagged, doors were locking. A tide was shifting, the one I'd set in motion weeks ago. They didn't feel it yet, but the balance was gone. The safety net had vanished. I smiled faintly, lifting my glass as if in toast. The room shimmered in candlelight and noise, but underneath it, silence had already begun its slow approach, patient, certain, unstoppable. They just didn't know the feast they celebrated tonight would be their last supper of ignorance. The truth was already at the door. My father stood slowly, the kind of man who never moved unless he expected the room to follow. The light from the chandelier caught the rim of his glass, scattering golden flecks across the walls like a halo that didn't belong to him. He cleared his throat, that practiced, commanding sound that once silenced boardrooms and family arguments alike. To family, he said, his voice smooth and certain. The words rippled across the table like a script everyone already knew by heart. My mother smiled, raising her glass out of habit rather than meaning. My brother grinned, his confidence too sharp, too proud. To loyalty, he added, that smug glimmer in his eye returning. And that was it, the word that did it. Loyalty. It hung in the air, polished and poisonous. The same word they'd used when they shut me out of the company. When they told me that business came before blood, they used it like armor, but to me, it had always been a blade. I felt the smile touch my lips before I realized it was there. Slow. Controlled. I lifted my glass, not high, but deliberately, each movement calculated. The wine caught the candlelight, turning red as blood. To consequences, I said quietly. The word slipped through the air, softer than a whisper, but heavy enough to change the atmosphere itself. It wasn't a toast. It was a verdict. And in that single moment, surrounded by laughter and glass and ghosts, I made it known, the reckoning had begun. The sound of crystal faded, and for the briefest heartbeat, so did the noise. A pause, not awkward, not confused, but electric. Like the world itself had taken a breath it didn't know it was holding. Then my brother laughed, too loud, too quickly. "You've always had a strange sense of humor," he said, reaching for his glass again. His voice trembled just slightly, though he'd never admit it. My father forced a chuckle, a brittle sound that cracked around the edges. But I said nothing. I didn't need to. The clock on the wall ticked again, 8:31. The second hand moved with perfect precision, steady, inevitable. Each tick felt like a countdown. The wine burned as it slid down my throat, its sweetness long gone. It tasted bitter now, like old memories and long-held revenge. I set the glass down gently, the sound sharp against the polished wood. Outside, the wind began to shift. A low rumble of thunder rolled through the night, distant but closing in. The lights flickered once, faintly. It was subtle, but I noticed. Everything was aligning. The storm, the silence, the moment. It was beginning. And they still thought it was just dinner. I lowered my glass, the echo of my own heartbeat steadying into something almost serene. Then, a buzz. A faint, mechanical vibration cut through the chatter, the kind of sound that doesn't belong in a room like this. At first, I thought it was mine again, but it wasn't. The sound came from across the table. My father frowned, reaching for his phone beside his plate. The gesture seemed so ordinary, so human, but the moment his thumb unlocked the screen, something in the air shifted. I watched as his confident expression faltered. The color drained from his cheeks, replaced by confusion first, then fear. He blinked once, reading the message again. "That's strange," he murmured, mostly to himself. "It's from the Treasury Department." The word struck the air like lightning. My mother looked up, startled. My brother froze mid-sentence, his laughter caught halfway in his throat. I didn't move. Didn't breathe. The world seemed to fold into silence, thick, expectant, alive. The rain outside began to patter against the windows, soft at first, then steadier, as though nature itself was leaning closer to listen. My heart beat once. Twice. Then calmed. "You'd better answer," I said softly, my voice slicing through the stillness. He hesitated, just a second, then pressed the phone to his ear. And in that moment, everything that had been buried began to surface. The ghosts, the lies, the numbers that no longer balanced. The storm outside broke. And inside, the silence did too. "Hello?" My father's voice cut through the hum of rain and candlelight. At first, it was calm, steady, commanding, the voice of a man who believed every problem could be solved with power or money. But something in the silence that followed unsettled him. A man's voice replied from the other end, muffled, clipped, professional. Even from across the table, I could hear the tone, cold, procedural, merciless. The kind of tone that doesn't bend for anyone, not even him. My father's brow furrowed. "Yes, this is Richard Hale," he said, his voice suddenly sharper. "What exactly do you mean, frozen?" He sat up straighter, as if posture alone could fix it, could rewrite what he was hearing. His hand gripped the phone tighter, knuckles whitening. The rest of the room had gone utterly still. My brother looked between us, his smirk gone, replaced by something that almost looked like fear. "What's happening?" he asked, his tone half whisper, half demand. No answer. Only the steady sound of the rain tapping against the window, and the faint hum of the chandelier above us, buzzing like a trapped insect. Then came the words that drained the color from my father's face. "All accounts, sir." Effective immediately. He didn't repeat them. He didn't need to. The silence spoke for him. When he finally lowered the phone, it wasn't slow or dramatic. It was careful, like he was afraid it might burn him. The screen's light faded, but its weight didn't. He turned to me. His voice, the same one that once commanded boardrooms, that once silenced me, came out quiet, almost human. "You know something about this?" The tremor in his tone betrayed him. Fear. Not the fear of loss, he could handle that. It was the fear of losing control. Of realizing someone had been playing a longer game than he had. I leaned forward, folding my hands. "No," I said calmly. Then after a pause, "But maybe it's time someone finally did something about how you've been running things." His jaw clenched. His shoulders squared again, the mask returning, if only for show. "You didn't," he said. It wasn't a question. It was disbelief, the sound of a man who couldn't accept that his own blood had outmaneuvered him. I let the silence stretch before answering. A smile tugged at the corner of my mouth, not triumph, not cruelty. Just inevitability. "You always told me business is about who you know," I said softly. I guess I finally met the right people. For a moment, neither of us breathed. The rain outside grew heavier, hammering against the glass like impatient fingers. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled again, low, deliberate, like a warning. And in that sound, I swear I could hear the company collapsing, floor by floor. The tension finally broke with a single crash. My brother shot up from his chair, the glass in his hand tipping over and shattering against the table. Red wine spilled across the white tablecloth, blooming like blood through fabric. "You ruined everything," he shouted, his voice cracking under the weight of panic. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" His face twisted, not in sadness, but in terror. The kind of fear born from knowing the life he'd built was made of paper, and the fire had already started. I leaned back in my chair, unbothered, watching the stain spread toward him. The wine seeped into the wood grain, dark and permanent. "Not yet," I said quietly. "But I think we're about to find out." For a heartbeat, no one spoke. The storm outside grew louder, wind rattling the glass panes as if the house itself were holding its breath. Then, a sound. Soft at first, then sharper. Gravel crunching. Tires slowing. And finally, the low rumble of an engine cutting off just outside the gate's asterisk. All three of us turned toward the window at once. Headlights glowed faintly through the rain, two beams slicing through the darkness, motionless now. No one moved. No one spoke. But in that silence, the truth was clear. Whatever was about to walk through that door wasn't just an ending. It was the beginning of their reckoning. The laughter was gone now. Only the rain remained, a steady hiss against the windows, like the world outside was whispering secrets the house could no longer keep. Then came the lights. Headlights. They cut through the darkness like white knives, flashing through the window panes, slicing across the polished wood floor and the faces around the table. The light flickered over crystal, silverware, and wine stains, illuminating the quiet ruin of what had once been a celebration. My mother was the first to move. Her chair scraped against the floor, the sound jarring in the silence. She stood, her eyes wide, one trembling hand pressed to her chest. "Who's that?" she whispered. Her voice sounded small, like a child's. No one answered. My father didn't need to. He was already staring toward the window, jaw set, the reflection of the headlights burning in his eyes. He knew. He'd always known this day would come, just not tonight. Not here. Not with the smell of roasted lamb and cedar still hanging in the air. Outside, a car door slammed. Then another. The sound of boots crunching through snow followed, steady, synchronized, deliberate. The sound of authority. I sat motionless, hands folded neatly in my lap, feeling my heartbeat slow instead of quicken. It was happening faster than I'd expected. But perfectly on time. "Don't answer the door," my brother said suddenly. His voice cracked as he grabbed for his phone, his movements frantic now, desperate. "I need to make a call," he muttered, already scrolling, his fingers slipping across the screen. Before he could dial, it came, a sound that froze the room. Knock. 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 3 sharp knocks. Measured. Heavy. Certain. It wasn't the polite kind of knocking you hear from guests or neighbors. It was the kind that announces itself. The kind that doesn't wait to be invited in because it already has the right to enter. My brother's phone slipped from his hand, landing on the floor with a dull thud. "It's them," I said quietly. The words carried across the room, calm and certain. "They don't usually make appointments." My father turned toward me, eyes narrowing. The mask of composure was gone now, stripped away, leaving only the man underneath, terrified, furious, and utterly helpless. His hand trembled as he straightened his jacket, as if pride could still save him from what waited on the other side of that door. The air grew colder, heavier. Even the fire in the hearth seemed to burn quieter, as if watching. He hesitated. Just for a second. Then he reached for the handle. The moment the door opened, everything changed. Cold air surged into the room, carrying the sharp scent of snow, rain, and inevitability. The chandelier flickered as the temperature dropped, the warm glow replaced by something pale and merciless. 2 men stood in the doorway, their dark coats dusted with snow, their presence filling the space like a shadow that didn't belong. Behind them, a third figure waited by the car, a silhouette against the storm, silent and still. "Mr. Dalton," one of the men said, his voice even, professional, and utterly devoid of emotion. He held up a document encased in a clear folder. "We have a warrant." For a heartbeat, no one moved. My father's hand fell to his side. The paper shook slightly in the officer's grasp, not from fear, but from the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone in the room. My brother took a step back, his expression collapsing into disbelief. He looked at me then, searching for some trace of explanation, some glimmer of mercy. But I offered neither. The silence between us was almost tender, a quiet acknowledgement that this was always how it had to end. "You," he whispered, his voice barely holding itself together. "You did this." I smiled softly, the same calm, unbroken smile I'd worn all evening. The one they mistook for weakness. "No," I said, rising from my chair. "I finished what you started." The officer stepped inside. Papers unfolded. Words were exchanged. The formal rhythm of justice replaced the chaos of denial. As they led my father away, I reached for my wine glass, the last one still standing, and lifted it slightly in their direction. "Merry Christmas," I said quietly. The words hung in the cold air, simple and final. And as the door closed behind them, the only thing left was the sound of the storm, washing the world clean. The door had barely closed behind the officers, and the room exploded into noise, the kind of chaos that twists the stomach and makes the walls themselves feel alive with panic. My father's voice rose first, sharp, demanding, trembling, laced with disbelief. "What is this? What do you mean frozen?" "My accounts, my business." His hands waved wildly, knocking over a half-empty glass of wine, the crimson liquid spilling across the polished wood like a warning. My brother, equally stunned, shouted over him, but the officers were unshaken. Calm. Methodical. They didn't flinch at the anger, the tears, or the chaos that filled the room. Their voices were quiet but firm, each syllable carrying authority. "Your accounts are frozen pending investigation," one said, his tone clinical, devoid of sympathy. "We'll need to ask you some questions." The sound of papers shuffling, folders opening, and the occasional metallic click of handcuffs filled the room, a symphony of consequences. It was organized, precise, inevitable. Lives that had seemed untouchable were crumbling before our eyes, right there in that dining room. I sat back in my chair, composed, almost detached, watching it all unfold. Every shout, every protest, every faltering word from them was a note in the song of reckoning I'd composed in silence for years. My mother's voice rose next, trembling, almost broken. She moved toward the officers, hands clasped, eyes wide with fear and disbelief. "There must be some mistake," she cried. "This isn't right, we haven't done anything. You can't just..." Her voice broke. Tears rolled down her cheeks, tracing paths that matched the tremor in her lips. But the officers did not respond. Their attention was singular, unwavering, and their verdict already written in the evidence spread across the table. "We've been watching this for months," one said quietly. "Every transaction, every fraudulent invoice, every act of deception. It's all here, clear and undeniable." My father turned toward me, eyes filled with a mixture of rage, betrayal, and disbelief. His voice was low, trembling, almost pleading. "You did this," he said. You've destroyed us. Our legacy. Everything we built." I shook my head slowly, my gaze steady. My words were quiet, soft, but they cut deeper than any accusation he could have hurled. "No," I whispered, letting each syllable resonate in the silent room. "You destroyed yourself." It was not gloating. Not triumph. It was merely truth, long denied, now delivered. They had chosen greed over honor, deception over loyalty, and I had only waited for the moment the scales would finally tip. The door slammed behind them as they led my father and brother out into the cold night. The sound lingered, sharp, final, impossible to ignore. The house, once alive with forced laughter and casual arrogance, now felt hollow. Every corner echoed the absence of control, the collapse of illusions. My mother sat down beside me, trembling, her hands clasped in her lap. Her eyes searched mine, pleading, needing some explanation, some comfort. "Why?" she whispered, the word barely audible over the wind outside. I turned to her, calm, unshaken, the weight of years behind my gaze. "Because sometimes," I said softly, deliberately, "karma needs a little help." The room remained quiet, almost reverent in its emptiness, when suddenly my phone buzzed again. I glanced down at the screen. A single message, terse, final, unavoidable. "It's done. All of them." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The storm was over. Justice had arrived. But this was more than victory. It was balance restored, truth eliminated, and a weight lifted that I had carried silently for years. And in that silence, in that heavy, calm aftermath, I finally understood power could be wielded not through fear or rage, but with patience, precision, and a quiet, unrelenting resolve. I looked out the window at the snow swirling in the streetlights, the cold night carrying the echoes of what had just happened. Everything had changed. Everything was clear. And for the first time in a long time, I smiled, not with malice, not with revenge, but with freedom. The room felt heavy, weighed down by a silence that hadn't existed moments ago. My brother paced back and forth like a caged animal, his footsteps harsh against the polished floor, echoing in the cavernous dining room that had once been full of warmth, laughter, and arrogance. His hands tugged at his hair, his eyes wild, darting from the empty chairs to the remnants of wine glasses and spilled napkins, as if seeking some anchor in the chaos. "We can fix this," he said, voice strained, urgent, teetering on the edge of hysteria. "We can hire a lawyer. We can negotiate. We can..." He stopped mid-sentence, his shoulders sagging as realization sank in. The words had lost their power. The empire he had always believed unbreakable, the wealth he flaunted like a crown, the reputation that once commanded fear and admiration, it was all gone. I had ensured that every thread of their illusion unraveled, every secret exposed, every misdeed accounted for. Outside, the gentle patter of rain turned to snow, tiny flakes brushing against the frosted window panes. It fell softly, almost deliberately, as if nature itself wanted to mute the remnants of the storm inside, the chaos, the panic, the desperation. Each flake seemed to mirror the fragility of their world, delicate yet unstoppable, covering the traces of what had just happened. He turned to me, desperation blazing in his eyes, the kind that comes when control is finally stripped away and the foundations of certainty collapse. "Why didn't you just come to me?" he demanded, voice cracking. The words were raw, almost childlike in their vulnerability, a sound I had never expected to hear from someone who had once held himself above everyone else. "Because I did," I said softly, deliberately. My gaze met his, unwavering, calm, carrying years of careful planning, of patience, of silent observation. "You just didn't listen." He blinked, as if absorbing the weight of my words for the first time. The truth struck him like cold water. "You didn't just ruin the business," he said quietly, his voice nearly a whisper now. "You ruined us. Everything we believed we had, everything we thought we controlled, it's all gone." I took a deep breath, letting the moment stretch between us like the quiet before the next storm. I looked at him one last time, not with malice, not with triumph, but with a sense of completion, of inevitability. "No," I said. "I freed us. It wasn't just him I meant. It wasn't just the money or the company. I had freed myself, freed the truth from their lies, freed every person their greed had harmed." For the first time, the room felt lighter, though no one else could see it. The clock ticked past 9, each second echoing louder than the sirens that were now fading into the distance outside. The streets were quiet, the snow thickening, muting the world like a velvet blanket. Inside, the weight of silence descended, but it wasn't heavy in the way despair feels. It was the kind of silence that follows a storm, the calm that comes when chaos has been tamed, when the scales of justice have finally balanced. For the first time in years, I could breathe without hesitation. The laughter, the lies, the cruelty, all of it had dissipated. And yet, even in this quiet, a question lingered, curling like smoke in the cold air. When karma finishes, when the scales are finally balanced, does it ever truly stop? I stared out at the window, watching the snow swirl and settle, blanketing the world in a hushed purity. My reflection in the glass was pale, calm, almost ghostly, a figure who had survived the storm she had endured silently for so long. The truth had arrived. Justice had arrived. And for the first time, I realized peace didn't require applause, or recognition, or revenge. It simply required patience, resolve, and the courage to wait until the right moment came. And in that silence, I understood the most important truth of all. Freedom doesn't come from what you destroy, it comes from what you finally release. Later that night, when the house had finally settled into a tense, uneasy silence, I found myself alone in the dining room. The lingering aroma of wine, half-empty glasses, and cold, untouched food hung in the air like a ghost of the evening's chaos. The chandelier above flickered, tiny sparks of light creating shadows that danced across the walls, shadows that looked like the phantoms of every memory I had buried here, every word of cruelty, every slight I had endured. I thought back to that night so many years ago, the night they had pushed me out. The night they told me I wasn't family anymore. The rain had been relentless then, drumming on the roof and windows like a mournful symphony, mixing with the sound of the front door slamming shut behind me. The cold had cut through my coat and into my chest, and the shame had burned brighter than any storm outside. Tonight, the house was still, but the sound was entirely different. The chaos of that old storm had been replaced by a profound quiet. The only noise now was the echo of justice finally finding its way into the rooms where it had been denied for so long. The silence was heavy, yes, but it was a different weight, a weight that carried satisfaction, that carried the calm after the reckoning. Every chair, every silver fork, every polished surface felt like witnesses to the turn of events, to the night when power and greed were finally held accountable. I pulled my phone from my pocket, the small device glowing like a beacon in the dimly lit room. The messages from my contact stared back at me, a simple string of words that carried the weight of months of careful planning. "We got them all." The glow from the screen reflected in my eyes, and for a moment, I thought I would feel triumph, the rush of revenge I had always imagined when planning this night. But the truth was more complicated. It wasn't victory I felt. It wasn't the thrill of watching them fall. It was balance. The equilibrium of justice restored. I had never sought revenge, I had only ever sought accountability. Yet sometimes, I realized, accountability and revenge are mirror images of each other, two sides of the same coin. And in this quiet, cold glow, that realization sent a shiver down my spine. I understood then that what had been set in motion was bigger than me, bigger than anger or resentment. It was a reckoning, and I had been the patient hand that guided it to its inevitable conclusion. Somewhere in the vast, silent house, I heard the soft, trembling sound of my mother crying. Her sobs were faint, almost reverent, a fragile acknowledgement of the events that had just unfolded. I felt the impulse to rise, to move toward her and offer comfort, to wrap her in an embrace and remind her that the world wasn't entirely cruel. But then I remembered the years of silence. The years she had looked the other way as they humiliated me, erased me, diminished my presence. She had always chosen comfort over courage, silence over intervention. And for the first time, I understood the limits of compassion when paired with denial. So I stayed seated, letting the echoes of her grief resonate through the room, and whispered softly, more to the air than to her, "Now you'll understand." The words were not cruel, they were a quiet reckoning, a gentle acknowledgement that truth had finally spoken. And as I spoke, the clock struck midnight. The sound was loud in the stillness, resonating through the empty dining room like a bell tolling for the end of an era. The past and present converged in that moment, the girl who had been cast out, the woman who had endured, and the orchestrator of justice, all coexisting in the same space. And for the first time, I felt a strange calm, as though the night itself had bowed to the inevitability of truth. Morning sunlight crept slowly through the curtains, pale and cold, spilling into the quiet house like a reluctant witness. The soft, early light cut across the furniture and walls, revealing details I hadn't noticed in the chaos of the previous night, the faint fingerprints on the silverware, the scattered napkins, the lingering shadows of tension that seemed to cling stubbornly to the corners of every room. The house looked different in daylight. The grand, imposing rooms felt smaller, almost fragile, stripped of the illusion of wealth and power. Every corner whispered the aftermath of a storm, the truth, finally visible. My brother sat at the kitchen table, hunched over his phone, staring with a disbelief that made the air itself feel heavy. "It's everywhere," he muttered, his voice trembling. "The story, the company's gone." The words sounded unreal, like fragments from a nightmare that refused to fade upon waking. Yet it was real. Every shadowed corner of their empire, the lies, the hidden accounts, the manipulation, the corruption, had been exposed. It wasn't just numbers on a screen or a headline in the paper, it was the tangible collapse of everything they had built on greed and deception. The walls seemed to echo his words, each syllable reverberating like the toll of a bell announcing the end of an era. When he finally lifted his gaze from the phone, his eyes were hollow, drained of their usual arrogance, of the confidence he had always worn like armor. "You really did it," he said, voice low, almost hoarse. I nodded, slowly, deliberately. "Because no one else would," I said. The words hung in the air, heavy, like a shadow draped across the room. He wanted to be angry, to shout, to lash out with the fury of someone losing everything he thought was untouchable, but he had no strength left for anger. His chest rose and fell unevenly, his usual bluster replaced by stunned silence. "You're going to be alone now," he said, almost as a statement, almost as a threat. I smiled faintly, a quiet, controlled smile that had no warmth but carried the weight of inevitability. "I already am," I whispered. In that simple admission lay a truth that stretched wider than the room, wider than the collapse of the empire around us. Alone. Free. Observing the consequences of their own choices. The silence between us was profound, a chasm filled with the echoes of the past, the laughter, the mockery, the dismissive words that had defined my childhood, my adulthood, my every attempt to be seen. The truth didn't just hang in the room, it seeped into every fiber of it, a shadow that clung to the air and reminded us both of the cost of their choices. He left the room without another word. The front door closed behind him with a solid, final thud, echoing across the house like the punctuation mark at the end of a story. The sound resonated in the empty spaces, bouncing off the walls, mingling with the faint smell of cold coffee and lingering tension. I sat back in the chair, hands wrapped around the mug, sipping the last of the bitter liquid, tasting the faint undertone of triumph, but more than that, of clarity. Outside, the morning was quiet, the street empty, as if the world itself were holding its breath after witnessing the storm that had just passed. Even now, in the soft, still light of dawn, I could hear the faint echoes of last night, the rush of footsteps, the sound of authority, the panic in voices that had once commanded rooms and boardrooms alike. It lingered like a memory, a reminder that truth has a resonance, a sound that refuses to be ignored. And in that silence, I understood fully, the empire was gone, the lies were exposed, and the consequences had arrived. But more than anything, the quiet revealed the new reality, one where the past could no longer hurt me, one where freedom was measured not by power or wealth, but by the weight lifted from my shoulders. I was present, alive, and unbroken, and for the first time I was entirely in control of my own story. The familiar warmth of the dining room, once filled with the hum of conversation and laughter, shattered abruptly when streaks of blue light danced across the frosted windows. The first knock hit the door, sharp, deliberate, heavy, and it seemed to echo through the walls as if carrying the weight of judgment itself. Time slowed, the laughter that had once masked tension dissolved into sudden, muffled panic. Whispers erupted, hurried and frantic, blending with the faint tremor of shaking hands and the precarious tilting of half-full wine glasses, each trembling as if they sensed the storm outside. Her father's face, usually commanding and composed, drained of every hint of color as the second knock came, louder, more insistent, a metallic drumbeat of inevitability. Outside, the muffled commands and sharp voices of authority cut through the crisp winter air. Boots crunched against snow, radios crackled with urgency, and a rustle of coats and keys hinted at a precision they couldn't escape. Inside, the family froze, each searching her eyes for an explanation she would never provide. Her brother hissed, trembling, his voice thin and desperate, "Who told them?" She said nothing, only letting her gaze drop to the wine glass in her hand. The final drop slid down the rim, slow and deliberate, a tiny silent tear marking the beginning of their reckoning. The door creaked open slowly, each movement dragging suspense like a heavy curtain. 2 officers stepped inside, their presence immediately cutting through the warmth of the room with a cold, surgical precision. The air itself seemed to change, sharp and brittle, as though the house had inhaled and now held its breath. "We have questions regarding financial fraud under your company's name," one of them said, voice calm, yet merciless, precise as a scalpel. Her father stammered, scrambling for excuses, words, even fleeting justifications, but every syllable cracked under the weight of inevitability. Her brother's arrogance faltered, disbelief flooding his expression, leaving him silent, powerless. The officers laid stacks of documents and printed accounts on the table, evidence that spoke louder than any protest or denial. She stood behind them, unnoticed, almost invisible, as their meticulously built world began to crumble. The officers exchanged a brief, knowing glance, a signal that everything was already accounted for. And as one of them reached for the handcuffs, she understood fully, this was the sound of justice arriving, cold and unwavering, in the quietest and most undeniable way possible. The flashing blue lights outside cast fractured patterns across the silverware, the polished wood, and the walls, turning familiar objects into abstract reflections of chaos and inevitability. Her mother sobbed quietly in the corner, the sound small and pitiful, while her father repeated over and over, "It's a misunderstanding," each word thinner than the last, each repetition betraying the futility of denial. Her brother remained frozen, his bravado stripped away, replaced by raw disbelief. She stepped away from the table slowly, deliberately, feeling the weight of years, the belittlement, the erasure, the dismissals, left with each measured breath. The air was thick with the smell of spilled wine, paper, and secrets, metallic and final, heavy with truth. As the officers led her father out, he turned toward her, eyes wide with confusion, more questions than anger. "Did you know about this?" he whispered, his voice trembling under the weight of revelation. She met his gaze, calm and detached, letting the truth radiate from her without a single word of justification. "I warned you," she said softly, her voice steady, "truth doesn't stay buried forever." The door clicked shut behind them, and for the first time that evening, the house fell silent. But this silence was not empty, it was different, heavy with finality, saturated with justice, and infused with the strange, exhilarating clarity of inevitability. The storm had passed, the reckoning was complete, and the world inside the walls had changed forever. Outside, the snow fell in soft, glowing sheets, each flake drifting lazily down as if time itself had slowed to watch. They settled over the footprints leading to the police cars, erasing every mark, every trace of the night's chaos. The world was quiet, eerily so, almost peaceful, as though the storm inside the house had never existed. She stepped carefully onto the porch, the cold biting at her cheeks, turning them rose-red, but it also cleared her mind, sharpening her thoughts and bringing a strange sense of calm. Wrapped tightly in her coat, she felt the weight of the night lift with each measured breath. In the distance, faint siren echoed, weaving with the whisper of the wind through the snow-laden pines, a haunting symphony that reminded her of everything she had endured. Her mind drifted back to the little girl she had once been, innocent, trusting, naive, the one who believed her family could do no wrong. That girl was gone now, buried under years of lies, betrayals, and silenced frustration. In her place stood someone stronger, colder, someone tempered by injustice, and finally unbound. Freedom had a sharp edge, and she felt it slice clean through the remnants of the past. The first hints of sunrise began to break through the horizon, spilling light across the snow like molten gold and silver, turning every icy flake into a tiny, glittering jewel. She walked to the wrought iron gate, the deep tire tracks from the police cars pressed into the slush beneath her boots, stark evidence of what had happened. The quiet hum of the world returning to normal was almost surreal, like a dream that had ended abruptly, leaving behind only the bittersweet taste of truth and reckoning. Her phone buzzed sharply in her pocket, breaking the silence. She drew it out, noting the unknown number, the same one that had changed everything. Her fingers hesitated before answering, almost reluctant to touch the device that had been her silent partner in this orchestration. A voice came through, calm and resolute, "It's done." And then silence, a click ending the conversation. She stared at the screen for a long moment, realizing that this call wasn't a conclusion, it was the signal of a new beginning, one she could finally steer. A small, almost imperceptible smile curved across her lips, as if the cold wind itself had whispered a soft promise of closure and clarity. She turned her gaze back toward the house, the grand structure that had once symbolized wealth, pride, and untouchable power. Now it stood silent and dim, its lights muted, its walls thick with ghosts and memories that would never leave. For the first time in years, she felt none of the anger or sorrow that had once defined her nights. Instead, there was only peace, sharp, profound, and absolute, a weightless, rare clarity that filled her chest. The snow continued to fall steadily, erasing all traces of the night's turmoil, leaving the world pristine and unblemished. She whispered softly to herself, a ritual acknowledgement of closure, "Let the truth rest now." And then she stepped forward, moving away from the house, each step lighter than the last. With every pace, the world she had feared and endured collapsed behind her into silence, leaving only possibility ahead. Ahead of her waited a new beginning, calm, endless, and entirely hers. The air was crisp, the light soft, and the snow carried the quiet promise that the past could no longer bind her. For the first time, she was free. The morning sun rose slowly, stretching its pale, golden fingers over the frozen expanse of the house, casting long, fragile shadows that trembled across the snow-laden ground. The house, once towering with pride and opulence, now seemed smaller, humbled by the weight of its own secrets. Its walls, which had echoed with whispered betrayals, laughter twisted into cruelty, and unspoken resentments, now stood silent, frozen in time like an unwilling witness to all that had transpired within. The snow that blanketed the roof shimmered under the tentative sunlight, glinting like 1,000 tiny diamonds, a silent testament to everything that had happened beneath it, the schemes, the lies, the ambitions, and the destruction they had all wrought. For the first time in years, she didn't feel the need to run from what had been, nor the urge to fight against the ghosts that lingered. The storm that had raged for so long, both within and around her, was finally over. For decades, she had existed as the quiet one, the overlooked, underestimated, and forgotten presence in a household consumed by ego and entitlement. She had swallowed the bitterness of constant dismissal, of being mocked, and of being left behind, carrying it silently like a stone in her chest. Each insult, each sly comment, each derisive laugh had been absorbed, catalogued, and stored away in the quiet recesses of her mind. Yet those years of silence were not empty. They had been a crucible, slowly forging her patience, sharpening her insight, and awakening a clarity that had lain dormant beneath layers of neglect and oppression. When the laughter of others had turned cruel, when truth had begun to rot beneath the weight of their lies, something profound inside her had stirred, not hatred, not vengeful desire, but a pure, unflinching clarity. The kind of clarity that emerges when one finally stops trying to mend what was never meant to be whole, when one accepts the world as it is and uses it to understand one's own strength. As she walked away from the house, the snow crunching softly under her boots, her thoughts lingered on the last words that had changed everything. "We're freezing all accounts." Those words had carried the weight of inevitability, the final punctuation on a lifetime of lies. And it wasn't just the company that had been frozen, it was the empire of deception, the legacy built on greed, the illusions of power that had blinded them to everything that truly mattered. In the stillness of that frozen morning, she understood something profound. Justice does not always arrive with clamorous fanfare, with dramatic proclamations or explosive confrontations. Sometimes, justice comes quietly, almost imperceptibly, like a winter storm that sweeps across the land, erasing everything that is false and leaving only truth in its wake. She hadn't needed to destroy them. That had never been the goal. She simply held up a mirror, letting them see themselves for what they truly were, the embodiment of their own greed, arrogance, and moral failure. It was the reflection that had shattered them, far more than any external force could have done. Watching them confront the truth, stripped bare and powerless, had been enough. That revelation, that moment of seeing one's own reflection for the first time without delusion, had been the most devastating force imaginable. As the sun climbed higher, bathing the world in soft, golden light, she stepped forward into a reality that finally felt empty in the most necessary, liberating ways. The oppressive weight of secrets, of facades, of pretending to be someone she was not, had lifted. All that remained was the sound of her own footsteps on the snow, crisp and solitary, echoing in the silence of the morning. Each step carried with it the sensation of freedom growing, spreading like warmth beneath the cold, seeping into her bones, invigorating her spirit, and reminding her that she alone now controlled the narrative of her life. And when she finally paused, lifted her gaze to the horizon, and whispered softly to herself, "It's done," the words resonated with the fullness of everything she had endured. They did not signal an ending. They did not carry the finality of closure in the traditional sense. Instead, they rang with the quiet, undeniable promise of a new beginning, a beginning shaped by truth, by clarity, and by the unshakable knowledge that she was finally free. The morning, the snow, the light, the silence, all of it bore witness to the rebirth of someone who had survived, endured, and emerged from the storm not broken, but stronger, sharper, and entirely her own. Peace, at last, had arrived.